Cultural Genocide. 13 Things You Haven't Been Told About Residential Schools, Mass Graves, and Broken Treaties in Canada. Written and narrated by Drew Eldridge. Note on the text. The following article was originally published in the Letter to the Editor section of Christian Voices in July of 2021 after the attacks on several Canadian churches. Thank you to everyone who reached out and encouraged me to have it printed into a booklet. I'm glad you found value in it and agree that the information contained is worth sharing with a wider audience. Anything to help stop the violence. If you are reading this for the first time or are wondering what attacks on churches I am referring to, here are a few headlines from 2021 that might help provide some context. Remains of 215 children found buried at former BC residential school, First Nation says. CBC News. 23 Canadian churches and counting under attack. The Western Standard. This Canada Day, let's remember this country was built on genocide. The Guardian. 2 more churches burned down in BC's interior. CBC News. 5th church fire in BC. CTV News. 2 more Catholic churches burnt in Canada, probably linked to the discovery of mass graves of Indigenous children. Mirco Press. More churches burned in Canada after latest grave discovery at residential school. Vice News. Statues of Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth toppled in Canada. Reuters. At least 45 Christian churches set on fire in Canada as attacks escalate. CBN News. NDP seeking MPs' unanimous consent to label residential school experience as genocide. CBC. Burn it all down. Head of BC Civil Liberties Group resigns over tweet about church fires. National Post. Cultural genocide on discovery of hundreds of graves in Canada. The Hindu. 10 churches vandalized with paint. Winnipeg Free Press. Residential schools were part of genocide plan, Manitoba's Indigenous Reconciliation Minister says. CBC. The burning of Canada's churches. Wall Street Journal. A map of the 68 churches that have been vandalized or burned since the residential school's announcement. TNC News. Here's how some in northwestern Ontario are reflecting on Treaties Recognition Week. CBC. Churches burned down as anger over cultural genocide of Indigenous children sweeps Canada. The Telegraph. Churches are being burned to the ground in Canada. Loudwire. Residential schools were a key tool in America's long history of Native genocide. Washington Post. Churches burned to the ground in Canada in anti-church hate crime wave. Fox News. Winnipeg Mayor pledges to support Bishop Grandin renaming at City Council. CBC. Statue of the Queen toppled as Canadians protest the mass graves of Indigenous children. The Daily Beast. Terrible and tragic. Century-old Catholic Church in Morinville destroyed by fire. CBC. Canada pledges $40 billion in talks over rampant abuses of Indigenous children. NPR. Justin Trudeau says Pope Francis needs to apologize. Huffington Post. Ontario announces school curriculum changes to mandate Indigenous learning in grades 1 to 3. CTV News. Letter to the Editor, 2021. Hi Drew, I'd like to ask you about the residential schools, the bodies discovered, and the recent violent reactions to it. Did Christians commit cultural genocide? What is your opinion on all this? Susan T. from Winnipeg, Manitoba. In defense of our churches, 13 things you haven't been told about residential schools, mass graves, and treaty violations in Canada, by Drew Eldridge. That's an excellent question, Susan. Thank you for writing in. Yes, it's certainly true that cultural genocide is a common charge made against Christians in Canada. The popular narrative we're told is that European Christians came to North America, stole the land from the indigenous peoples, wiped out many of their communities, and then imposed things like residential schools on the survivors as a kind of assimilative cultural genocide. Children were torn from their parents' arms and dragged to schools where, if they survived being systematically starved, raped, or murdered, were forced to abandon their native spirituality and convert to Christianity. We are told that we should experience a personal sense of shame and guilt about this and take appropriate action. As the beneficiaries of that past, we should make amends for cultural genocide with regular public apologies, declarations of land recognition, demonstrations of solidarity, and advocacy of extensive material reparations. These accusations fuel resentment that can lead to the kinds of hate crimes against Christians that you've pointed out. But is it really true? Well, I think the answer to that question is complicated, and I'm not sure I'm interested in putting forth and defending a competing narrative at this point. What I will do, since you asked, is lay out a list of facts that I've discovered with links to sources that might help you figure out the answer for yourself. I believe that much of the confusion that you and other Christians are feeling about this matter is due to many things that have either been ignored, forgotten, or altogether omitted from public discourse. There are some things that many people are simply unaware of that make this narrative seem plausible, and which has unfortunately led to violence. As surprising and disturbing as some of these facts may be, I hope people you share them with will understand their purpose is to help bring more truth to truth and reconciliation. They are not intended to be provocative, but merely heard, reflected upon, and digested. Nor are they meant to downplay anyone's experience of abuse or defend residential schools in any way. They should always be presented in our conversations gently and respectfully, in a spirit of love. I will begin with a fact about colonialism and the myth about the state of affairs that European Christians supposedly robbed the native population of, and that we are often told they are now missing out on because of us. This is the first misconception that needs to be addressed. It's what's beneath most of the rhetoric about guilt and what grounds the narrative about cultural genocide as a whole. Fact number 1. the indigenous people of North America regularly engaged in mass killing, mass burial into unmarked graves, theft, land seizure, rape, gang rape, torture, slavery, kidnapping, child abuse, religious indoctrination, and breaking of land agreements for centuries prior to European contact. The popular narrative begins with the notion that indigenous people were more or less living in harmony, sharing the land and enjoying an abuse-free, genocide-free existence, until white Christian Europeans arrived and spoiled it. Tragically, however, everything from scientific archaeological evidence to the journals of explorers confirms that, like everywhere else in the world, pre-colonial North America was a mixed bag of good people and bad people, with most being somewhere in between. There are a lot of great books that document all this, if you're interested. In the journals, explorers praised and complimented many indigenous tribes, especially for their kindness, generosity, bravery, and sense of justice. Often, they would remark how the virtues displayed by some indigenous people often put the average European Christian to shame. However, these explorers also documented how there were other indigenous tribes in North America who were very different, and who often bullied and preyed upon the gentler, less warlike ones. Slaughter and burial into mass unmarked graves was one of these common practices. See the book for pictures, illustrations, photographs of all the bones and mass graves that archaeologists have discovered. It might even be the case that graves found around residential schools have nothing to do with Christians and were there long before the schools were even built. Archaeologists have methods of determining these things. Genocidal blood feuds were common as well, just as they have been in many other parts of the world. The Battle of Crow Creek is one of the most horrifying examples. Archaeologists have dated it to the 14th century. There's a little-known place called Skull Tower. Many believed it was myth. The mass unmarked grave was discovered by archaeologists in 2015. Explorers witnessed something called the scalping dance that some indigenous tribes performed after slaughtering rivals. After the men were ritually mutilated, women and children were taken as sex slaves. But even in many of the more humane tribes, explorers noticed that women and children were often treated poorly. Here is just one account by the explorer Alexander Mackenzie. Keep in mind that he writes this after praising these indigenous people for other things. Quote, "The females of this nation are in the same subordinate state with those of all other savage tribes. The infidelity of a wife is punished by the husband with the loss of her hair, nose, and perhaps life. Such severity proceeds from its having been practiced without his permission. For temporary interchange of wives is not uncommon, and the offer of their persons is considered as a necessary part of hospitality due to strangers. The life of these women is an uninterrupted succession of toil and pain. They are sometimes known to destroy their female children to save them from the miseries which they themselves have suffered. Many and various are the motives which induce a savage to war. To prove his course, or to revenge the death of his relations, or some of his tribe, by the massacre of an enemy." Unquote. In other words, it is entirely a myth that the indigenous people were living in peace and harmony prior to contact with European Christians. One effect of this idea is that when unmarked graves are found near residential schools, they are called evidence of genocide. But when they are found anywhere else, they are merely called indigenous burial grounds. This difference in judgment reveals the assumptions we make about what happened in these places. Another documented traditional indigenous custom was invasion and dispossession. Again, there are many books that reveal this. It may be the case that indigenous tribes like the Sioux were wrongfully displaced through colonization, but the Sioux took the same land from the Cheyenne, who got it from someone else. The idea that this land was shared peacefully is entirely fabricated. Conquest was not something introduced by the European Christians. This brings me to the next myth. Amidst demands for the Pope to apologize, you may be led to believe that the Catholic Church supported or encouraged the European displacement of indigenous people. But is this really true? Here is Pope Paul III in his own words, writing in 1537, quote, "The enemy of the human race, who opposes all good deeds in order to bring men to destruction, beholding and envying this, invented a means never before heard of, by which he might hinder the preaching of God's word of salvation to the people. He inspired his satellites who, to please him, have not hesitated to publish abroad that the Indians of the West and the South and other peoples of whom we have recent knowledge should be treated as dumb brutes created for our service, pretending that they are incapable of receiving the Catholic faith. We, who, though unworthy, exercise on earth the power of our Lord, and seek with all our might to bring those sheep of his flock who are outside into the fold committed to our charge. Consider, however, that the Indians are truly men, and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but, according to our information, they desire exceedingly to receive it. Desiring to provide ample remedy for these evils, we define and declare by these our letters, or by any translation thereof, signed by any notary public, and sealed with the seal of any ecclesiastical dignitary, to which the same credit shall be given as to the originals, that, notwithstanding whatever may have been or may be said to the contrary, the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by the Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property, nor should they be in any way enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect." End quote. Sublimis Deus, 1537. This is an echo of the same thing Pope Eugene IV declared 60 years earlier, long before Europeans came to North America. He had been observing abuses in the Canary Islands and decided to make it perfectly clear what he thought the appropriate actions of every true Christian should be. Quote, "They have deprived the natives of their property, or turned it to their own use. They have subjected some of the inhabitants of said islands to perpetual slavery, sold them to other persons, and committed other various illicit and evil deeds against them. Therefore, we exhort, through the sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ shed for their sins, one and all, temporal princes, lords, captains, armed men, barons, soldiers, nobles, communitaries, and all others of every kind among the Christian faithful, of whatever state, grade, or condition, that they themselves desist from the aforementioned deeds, cause those subject to them to desist from them, and restrain them rigorously. And no less do we order and condemn all and each of the faithful of each sex that, within the space of 15 days of the publication of these letters, in the place where they live, that they restore to their pristine liberty all and each person of either sex who were once resident of the said Canary Islands, who have been made subject to slavery. These people are to be totally and perpetually free, and are to be let go without the exaction or reception of any money." Close quote. Far from supporting things like slavery, displacement, or subjugation, the Catholic Church was strongly and vocally against it, often threatening to excommunicate people who were involved. This is partly why the Indigenous people of Canada so often abandoned their old spiritual traditions. They saw the goodness of Jesus and the appeal of Christian morality. This brings me to the next matter, the myth of forced conversion. Fact number 2. Prior to the formation of Canada, Christian missionaries were generally welcomed by Indigenous people. Mass conversion was common and entirely voluntary. I've mentioned the journals of explorers, but there are also reports of missionaries written over the centuries. Far from going place to place imposing Christianity on people, they typically went completely unarmed. The Indigenous people of Canada were often known for their curiosity about the Creator and open-mindedness about other religions. The teachings of Christianity sometimes weren't even all that different from their own. Many discovered and welcomed the idea that Christianity was a completion of, not a replacement for, their traditional religions. Today, many Indigenous people have chosen to continue embracing Christianity. Being a Christian doesn't mean having to let go of all Indigenous traditions. Fact number 3. From the beginning of the formation of Canada, the Canadian government offered full equality to the Indigenous peoples. Some accepted and some rejected the offer. The infamous Indian Act was the result of that rejection. Indian didn't necessarily mean an Indigenous person in the 1800s. It was a word used to describe Indigenous people who didn't want to be treated as free and equally under the law. There is a commonly held belief that the Indian Act was created because Europeans were racist and wanted to treat Indigenous people differently. Nothing could be further from the truth. All the evidence we have shows that the colonies believed Indigenous people had the full potential to live peacefully and productively as equals to them under a common law. The Indian Act was established in spite of, not because of, what most of them believed about Indigenous people. Some Indigenous people accepted the invitation, others did not. For that reason, the Indian Act was established. Full enfranchisement was offered until 1985, when it was abolished. Today, there is no path to such equality. Indigenous people, or Indians as the government identifies them as, are now celebrated by our government as an officially, permanently disenfranchised group. Fact number 4. Treaties were violated by both sides. Violations of the Canadian government were often in response to perceived violations made by others first. If you make a deal with someone and they don't follow through on their side, then the deal might become null and void. Sometimes violations of treaties have been due to deception and betrayal. Someone might sign a treaty but really have other plans. Other times, treaties are broken because members of the represented group don't feel like they actually consented to it. Not every Indigenous person who was affected by the treaties felt like Indigenous leaders of the day legitimately represented them. Consequently, treaties didn't always play out the way leaders on both sides expected or hoped. On some occasions, violations were simply due to misunderstanding and confusion. Traditional indigenous cultures and languages were often very different. And just because a few people at the top might have understood what was being negotiated or what exactly the implications were, that didn't mean that people on the ground always did. News traveled slowly back then. People interpreted things differently. It simply wasn't the case that everyone was on the same page when treaties were made. Often, this resulted in people violating treaties without even knowing it. Nevertheless, these kinds of violations affected the validity of the deals made by the people who made them. Accident or not, a deal was a deal. This is why we believe it's fair to return and not pay for our food in a restaurant when they make mistakes with our orders. It happened back then with treaties as well. And it wasn't only one side making mistakes or being irresponsible. The debates about who broke what can be found in the primary sources. It's not always clear who was right, who was being the most honest, and who had the best intentions. One example would be Treaty 1, which applied here in Manitoba. A part of the agreement was the forbidding of alcohol to Indigenous people on the lands. The treaty reads that, quote, "The undersigned chiefs do hereby bind and pledge themselves and their people strictly to observe this treaty." Was this strictly observed? The treaty was also conditional upon them to, quote, "not interfere with the property or in any way molest the persons of Her Majesty's white or other subjects." Close quote. Was this always observed? It's also important to remember that these post-Confederate treaties were signed under the pretense of gradual assimilation. This is what the Queen and newly formed Canadian government told them they were signing up for. It's why they agreed to fund things like schools. However, this means that any resistance to gradual assimilation would have been perceived as violations. What I am saying is that no matter what you choose to believe about these things, it isn't as simple as Canada violated treaties. Often, in these situations, promises were broken because it was believed that the other side had broken them first. Fact number 5. The first residential schools in Canada were voluntary, welcomed, and even requested by Indigenous parents and leaders. The first residential schools in Canada were optional. Indigenous children didn't have to go unless their parents made them. Even the Truth and Reconciliation Report confirms this. In Chapter 30, the section on parental resistance, it says the main ways some parents resisted was to, quote, refuse to enroll students, refuse to return runaways, or refuse to return students at the end of summer holidays. Close quote. The key word here is enroll. The examples given of resistance make it even more evident that these institutions were voluntary and refusals were possible. In 1904, some Indigenous parents are on record for removing their daughter from a residential school. The response and argument of the principal, according to the Truth and Reconciliation Report, was in pointing out that the parents had, quote, signed the admissions form giving the government the right to determine when their daughter would be discharged, close quote. The parents left with the child. The principal warned them that there might be legal consequences, but the key thing to notice here is that they had signed them up. Parents, and even disappointed parents, were signing their children up for residential schools. But what about children being torn from their parents back in those days? Doesn't the Truth and Reconciliation Report address that? It certainly does, but it's worth taking a closer look at the language. Take, for instance, the section called Separating Children from Parents. The very title sounds menacing. It makes it sound like the government was going in and dragging the children away. However, if you read closely, you will find that the word separating isn't actually referring to forced removal. It's used in the geometrical sense of creating distance. Specifically, it is referring to a trend of preference among educators for long-distance learning. The section could have just as easily been entitled The Growing Trend Among Educators in Favor of Optional Long-Distance Boarding Schools for Indigenous People. The Truth and Reconciliation Report goes on to cite how Bishop Grandin wrote a letter to the Indian Commissioner to, quote, help him stop parents from taking their children, unquote, out of schools like Lac La Biche. But when you look at the actual letter of the bishop himself, what you'll find is that he was asking the commissioner to try and persuade parents, not force them. This was the nature of parental resistance and school counter-resistance when there was any. But the important thing to take away from this is that they were enrolling and unenrolling their children. Fact number 6. It's true John A. Macdonald called for assimilation of Indigenous people, but it's also true that many Indigenous people did too. At the time, the vast majority of Indigenous people were Christian and wanted Christianization. We've all heard the quote of Sir John A. Macdonald endorsing assimilation. But it's important to remember that assimilation wasn't really considered a bad word at the time. It wasn't something most Indigenous people found insulting, especially Indigenous Christians, for all assimilation really meant was the plan to aim for a society where white people and Indigenous people could live side by side as equals under the rule of law. Quote, the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. Close quote. In this respect, Sir John A. Macdonald wasn't all that different from Martin Luther King Jr. Education was considered one of the means to that end, just as it is today in all public schools. Interestingly, the truly controversial position for a white person to have was that Indigenous people should be left alone. Many Indigenous communities lived in extreme poverty. Sovereign communities developed very serious problems, such as alcoholism and disease. They also had difficulty competing on the global market. It wasn't something they were used to doing independently. Worst of all, this often became cyclical. Education was considered to be a way of breaking the cycle and empowering these communities. Sir John A. Macdonald is often accused of white supremacy, but wouldn't a true white supremacist be against integrating non-white people into their society? Think of all the money and time put into it. Today, Sir John A. Macdonald might be called a white supremacist and perpetrator of cultural genocide for his endorsement of assimilation. But back then, he would have been called those things if he were against assimilation. Poverty and disease in isolated Indigenous communities was sometimes so rampant that non-interventionalists would be accused of letting the Indigenous people go extinct. Fact number 7. The increase of residential schools was caused by the increasing demand for them by Indigenous parents and pressure put on the government by Indigenous leaders. While it may be the case that these optional residential schools had a slow start, they soon became so popular amongst Indigenous parents that the schools were often overcrowded. Complaints about overcrowding and underfunding put pressure on the government to provide more. In economics, there is something called the law of supply and demand. In the case of residential schools, the government and churches provided the supply, and the parents provided the demand. Here is an example of one such petition. Note that this is an all-Indigenous union. Notice that they are asking for more and better schools that will help prepare their children for, quote, civilized life. You can easily find this and many other examples by using the archive search engine. See page 22 of the book for screenshots of the petitions made by parents. Fact number 8. Indigenous parents and leaders are on record for wanting and even sometimes demanding specifically Christian residential schools. People who didn't want to support Christian residential schools were called fascists. As I mentioned earlier, Christian missionaries had been reaching out to the natives for a very long time. In large numbers, the Indigenous people of Canada were persuaded to choose Christianity over their traditional religions. These missions were so successful that by 1899, a census showed that over 70% of Indigenous people in Canada identified as Christian. It should be no surprise, then, that we find records of Indigenous parents and leaders insisting so passionately and in such large numbers that their children's schools be Christian in the 20th century. Again, see the book on page 24 for screenshots of documents that show this. In fact, you can read how the Indigenous peoples of Canada defended Christianity to the point that their leaders called people who wanted to change them fascists. It's in the same official court documents. The debates were less about whether Christianity should be taught and more about what kind of Christianity. They were also about who should teach it and who should have the power to make decisions. Complaints were more about incompetence, power dynamics, and bureaucracy, but there was little resistance to the teaching of Christianity itself. Fact number 9. There are official records of Indigenous parents and leaders criticizing residential schools for being too relaxed and pressuring the government to increase discipline. One thing you might have been told was that residential schools were unusually strict, and the sorts of places that Indigenous parents would resist or speak up against it. What you might not have been told is that the residential schools were often criticized for being too relaxed and giving too much freedom. Here is just one complaint that was issued about the excess of freedom and lack of discipline. As mentioned before, there are more you can find in the same official archives on the Canadian Parliamentary Historical Records website. Parents also got together with their representatives and complained that children who came home from residential schools were so undisciplined that children would sometimes have to have discipline whipped into them by their fathers. The government responded to these kinds of complaints and did their best to enact stricter disciplinary measures in residential schools over the coming decades. Fact number 10. Residential schools never became mandatory for Indigenous children. School attendance in general did. Prominent Indigenous leaders and representatives of the day advocated and supported for the forceful removal of Indigenous children from their homes into residential schools. It's been said that the government imposed residential schools on Indigenous people and forced children to attend. In reality, it was simply school in general that was made mandatory. It became mandatory for all children, not just Indigenous ones. Residential schools would only be mandatory for Indigenous children who had no other option, and who came from communities who either didn't want or weren't capable of opening schools of their own. Often, these were places where there was much reported neglect and abuse. This is partially why even Indigenous communities supported the forced removal of children from their parents when necessary. They agreed with the Canadian government that it was better for a child to be removed and sent to a Christian residential school for assimilation than to remain with their parents, where they might be neglected and either die or turn to crime or get caught up in cyclical poverty. Even the infamous 60s scoop was conceived of by listening and responding to petitions of Indigenous leaders made in the decades leading up to it. See the book on page 28 for screenshots of all this. Fact number 11. In general, Indigenous parents and leaders of the day who were opposed to residential schools opposed them because of the distance, not because of what was taught. Such parents preferred sending their children to day schools instead of residential schools because they felt day schools led to more, not less, assimilation. Cultural and religious assimilation wasn't controversial back in those days. It was something many Indigenous leaders openly advocated for. Documents like these show that the main issue parents had with residential schools, besides the lack of discipline or funding, wasn't what was taught, but the long distances from home and rare visitations. Quite understandably, parents tended to prefer being closer to their children. There are actually records of residential school staff complaining about parents coming and camping out near the schools so they could see their children. Parents weren't generally coming to take their children out of that kind of education system, but they did make petitions to the government to open day schools in their communities. Well-funded residential schools that were close were preferred to day schools that were too far. Parents missed their children, and I think every mother or father can relate and sympathize with that. The Canadian government did too. They tried to make some changes. Funding, however, was always difficult because much of this happened while wartime measures were in place or during events like the Great Depression. There wasn't always a large budget. Christian charity didn't always cover everything either. That's the main reason why children often had to help out with work while at residential schools. Groundskeepers, maids, and cooks were luxuries that were difficult to provide at the time. Fact number 12. In 1969, a time when there was frequently reported abuse, the Canadian government proposed to abolish the racist Indian Act, which would have meant total racial equality and the end of the residential schools. Indigenous leaders, represented by Indigenous parents, strongly opposed it, so the schools remained open. Today, a person might be accused of cultural genocide if they are in favor of the Indian Act and continuation of things like residential schools. But back then you'd be accused of it for wanting to abolish them. The Canadian government wanted and proposed abolishing the Indian Act that residential schools were founded upon. Everyone would be equal. Indigenous people would be free to either embrace or move away from their traditional Indigenous culture as they saw fit. Quote, presented to the first session of the 20th Parliament by the Honourable Jean Chrétien, Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. To be an Indian is to be a man, with all a man's needs and abilities. To be an Indian is also to be different. It is to speak different languages, draw different pictures, tell different tales, and to rely on a set of values developed in a different world. Canada is richer for its Indian component. Although there have been times when diversity seemed of little value to many Canadians. But to be a Canadian Indian today is to be someone different in another way. It is to be someone apart in law, apart in the provision of government services, and, too often, part in social contracts. To be an Indian is to lack power. The power to act as owner of your lands, the power to spend your own money, and, too often, the power to change your own condition. Not always, but too often, to be an Indian is to be without a job, a good house, or running water, without knowledge, training, or technical skill, and, above all, without those feelings of dignity and self-confidence that a man must have if he is to walk with his head held high. All these conditions of the Indians are the product of history and have nothing to do with their abilities or capacities. Indian relations with other Canadians began with special treatment by government and society. And special treatment has been the rule since Europeans first settled in Canada. Special treatment has made of the Indians a community disadvantaged and apart. Obviously, the course of history must be changed. To be an Indian must be to be free to develop Indian cultures in an environment of legal, social, and economic equality with other Canadians. The government believes that its policies must lead to the full, free, and non-discriminatory participation of the Indian people in Canadian society. Such a goal requires a break with the past. It requires that the Indian people's role of dependence be replaced by a role of equal status, opportunity, and responsibility, a role they can share with all other Canadians. This proposal is a recognition of the necessity made plain in a year's intensive discussions with Indian people throughout Canada. The government believes that to continue its past course of action would not serve the interests of either the Indian people or their fellow Canadians. The policies proposed recognize the simple reality that the separate legal status of Indians and the policies which have flowed from it have kept the Indian people apart from and behind other Canadians. The Indian people have not been full citizens of the communities and provinces in which they live, and have not enjoyed the equality and benefits that such participation offers. The treatment resulting from their different status has been often worse, sometimes equal, and occasionally better than that accorded to their fellow citizens. What matters is that it has been different. Many Indians, both in isolated communities and in cities, suffer from poverty. The discrimination which affects the poor, Indian and non-Indian alike, when compounded with legal status that sets the Indian apart, provides dangerously fertile ground for social and cultural discrimination. In recent years, there has been a rapid increase in the Indian population. Their health and education levels have improved. There has been a corresponding rise in the expectation that the structure of separate treatment cannot meet. A forceful and articulate Indian leadership has developed to express the aspirations and needs of the Indian community. Given the opportunity, the Indian people can realize an immense human and cultural potential that will enhance their own well-being, that of the regions in which they live, and of Canada as a whole. Faced with a continuation of past policies, they will unite only in a common frustration. The government does not wish to perpetuate policies which carry with them the seeds of disharmony and disunity, policies which prevent Canadians from fulfilling themselves and contributing to their society. It seeks a partnership to achieve a better goal. The partners in this search are the Indian people, the governments of the provinces, the Canadian community as a whole, and the government of Canada. As all partnerships do, this will require conciliation, negotiation, give and take, and cooperation if it is to succeed. Many years will be needed. Some efforts may fail, but learning comes from failure, and from what is learned, success may follow. All the partners have to learn. All will have to change many attitudes. Government can set examples, but they cannot change the hearts of men. Canadians, Indians, and non-Indians alike stand at the crossroads. For Canadian society, the issue is whether a growing element of its population will become full participants, contributing in a positive way to the general well-being, or whether, conversely, the present social and economic gap will lead to their increasing frustration and isolation, a threat to the general well-being of society. For many Indian people, one road does exist, the only road that has existed since Confederation and before, the road of different status, a road which has led to a blind alley of deprivation and frustration. This road, because it is a separate road, cannot lead to full participation, to equality in practice as well as in theory. In the pages which follow, the government has outlined a number of measures and a policy which it is convinced will offer another road for Indians, a road that would lead gradually away from different status to full social, economic, and political participation in Canadian life. This is the choice. Indian people must be persuaded, must persuade themselves, that this path will lead them to a fuller and richer life. Canadian society as a whole will have to recognize the need for changed attitudes and a truly open society. Canadians should recognize the dangers of failing to strike down the barriers which frustrate Indian people. If Indian people are to become full members of Canadian society, they must be warmly welcomed by that society. The government commends this policy for the consideration of all Canadians, Indians and non-Indians, and all governments in Canada. End quote. Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy. This was done in the same spirit of equality as the civil rights movement happening in the United States at the time. The difference was that, in Canada, these ideas of civil rights and equality were rejected by the parents and leaders of the people they would be extended to. As a result, institutions like residential schools had to remain open. Fact number 13. There have been many reports of positive experiences in residential schools that you can read. Quote, "You may have heard stories from 7,000 witnesses in the process that were negative," unquote, says residential school attendee Thompson Highway. Quote, "But what you haven't heard are the 7,000 reports that were positive stories. There are many very successful people today that went to those schools and have brilliant careers and are very functional people, very happy people like myself. I have a thriving international career, and it wouldn't have happened without that school." Close quote. Similar sentiments have been reported in letters that many have tried to ignore or cover up. I'll end with some quotations of just a few examples. I would like to stress that I believe these positive testimonies in no way justify abuses which took place in these schools. Even if one child were abused, it would be one too many. But I hope you'll consider them, along with the rest of these facts, when reflecting on this question of cultural genocide. Thanks again for writing in. Letters to Senator Bayek. As retired educators ourselves, with a combined experience of 26 years in Aboriginal and Métis schools, we witnessed firsthand the positive anecdotes and experiences of those who gained from their attendance at residential schools. Unfortunately, current orthodoxy forces their voices to be silenced. As the brother of a nun who worked in the system, and a nephew of a Jesuit who worked there too, I categorically refuse to believe that all the people who worked in these schools were as evil as they are being portrayed to be. Indeed, they were seeking, under the social rules that were generally accepted at the time, to do good and to help these children. I worked with the Chippewayan people as an employee of the Catholic Church from 1991 to 2001. I heard many positive comments by Native people who attended residential school in Fort Resolution. One woman, a chief of her community for some years, said, "I couldn't wait to go back to residential school. You were clean and you had good food." I knew another family, 8 children. The dad was a trapper who spent the winter on the barren lands. His wife contracted TB and was placed in the isolation hospital in the Fort Res. The children were taken by the dad each year to the school to keep them safe. It was hard for the youngest, who was only 4 years at the time. Traumatic even to be separated from parents and older siblings. However, the child survived, where otherwise he may not have. The schools must be viewed in the context of the social and economic circumstances at the time. My husband has worked and lived in several Aboriginal communities in the north, which greatly benefited from these schools and where the people speak very highly of the care and instruction they received. We are only given one side of the story. I spent over 10 years living and working on reserves and northern settlements, and I remember as a teacher how often we had to convince the population to keep their children at home and go to the day school rather than send them to a residential school. If the residential schools had been so bad, why were parents insisting that their children go? I personally saw a lot of good emanate from these schools. I do admit mistakes were made, but those same mistakes also existed in the population at large. Yet, most people were well-intentioned and worked with the knowledge they thought best. I have lived and worked in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan for a number of years and had the opportunity to meet retired teachers of residential schools and listened to their experiences as well. Those I met were all good, hard-working, and well-intentioned people. I also had the opportunity to meet First Nations people, teachers and lawyers, who are now effective leaders and advocates among and on behalf of their people, exactly because they received education in those residential schools. I attended a First Nations art exhibition in Fort McMurray, and I met a native artist who told me how grateful she was to the nuns and priests in her community who ran the schools because for her it was a place of refuge. She said that her parents would go out on the trap line and leave them to fend for themselves, and she would go and sit on the steps of the school and hope someone would help her. I myself am a product of the Catholic Covenant School, and while some people who attended that school with me will now say that the nuns were racists and treated them unfairly, that was not my experience. Yes, they were strict, but the principles of kindness and consideration for others were held in high esteem, and they instilled in me values that successfully took me through more than 40 years in the business world. My mother has a cousin who attended a residential school, and whenever she is asked about it, she tells that her experience was a good one. In fact, she credits the residential school system with having provided her the opportunity to have good education. Her experience in residential schools was so good that when the federal government offered a blanket cash settlement to all former attendees, she refused to take it. I know from first-hand experience that the residential schools provided a lot of good, and back in the 50s it gave children from the reserves the opportunity to witness life off the reserve, to be educated in more than a one-room schoolhouse for all, and to join in social programs to broaden their experience. I think of the many people who provided clothing and funding to help ensure the children had a good experience at the residential school while away from home. I am not naive enough to suggest that in some areas there weren't some serious problems which should never have happened, but you cannot tarnish the whole system with the same brush. Having worked for and with Aboriginal people in Northwest Ontario, many who are my friends, I support what you have said. Are there not two sides to this story? Why is only one side being expressed? Shame on our government. I grew up on a residential school, and although some aspects of it were hard, I also found the provincial public school even harder. I can never forget the violence of Canadian public schools. One Indigenous boy was beaten up so bad by a white boy in my high school that he was hospitalized. The school did nothing. I was assaulted on the school bus. Bus driver did nothing. No one got beaten in the residential school I attended. Corporal punishment was almost unheard of. My very worst memories of school was that of the provincial public schools and their strap-happy principals. I have never seen such hypocrisy as a government official apologizing. Secretly, they are only glad that they have spun the public mindset to have the churches take on the blame and responsibility the government should be shouldering. School days, the residential school experience. Quote, "The schools were not absolutely destructive. Between 2009 and 2011, many students have come forward to express their gratitude to former teachers at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission events. Their testimony is a reminder that not all residential school experiences are identical. Although few students went to residential schools willingly, once they were there were activities, sports, arts, reading, dancing, writing that many students came to enjoy. Even after they were old enough to leave, some chose to stay in school and complete their education. In certain cases, students developed lifelong relationships with their former teachers. Others not only finished high school, they pursued post-secondary education. Some went on to take leadership positions in Aboriginal organizations, the churches, and in society at large. Despite the shortcomings of the system, some students were able to adjust to it, and others achieved significant accomplishments. These positive experiences stand in the shadow of the system's overall failings, but they are also a part of the residential school story. Children who faced difficult home situations sometimes have more positive assessments of residential schools. In 1944, 12-year-old Rita Joe, an orphan, was living with relatives who alternately abused and neglected her. Fearful, she called the Indian agent and asked if he could arrange to have her admitted to the Shubenacadie school in Nova Scotia. Joe acknowledged that many negative things happened at the school, but she never regretted going there. In 1956, as a young mother with 4 children under 6 years of age, she and her husband Frank decided to send their oldest daughter, Shubenacadie. We knew she would get an education there and would be cared for until we were better off. Like Rita and Frank Joe, many other parents used residential schools as part of a family survival strategy. Louis Callahoo, a Métis man who went north to the Klondike in 1898 to make money during the gold rush, placed his sons in the Groard School. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, a Chilcotin father wrote his son in residential school, quote, "I didn't make much money this year, just enough to buy grub to live on. You are lucky to be in the school where you get plenty to eat. If you were at home, you would get hungry many days." Close quote. Florence Bird was born to Métis parents in Fort Chipewyan in 1899. After the death of her father, Joseph, in 1909, she was raised in the Holy Angels Covenant at Fort Chipewyan. A sickly child, she thought she would not have survived without the covenant. Quote, "There were a lot of pitiful kids in those days. The orphans were more pitiful than everybody else because they were badly treated by the people, and even by the relatives sometimes." Close quote. Although the nuns were strict, she thought that with so many children to supervise, they had few options. Martha McCready was another orphaned Métis child who was raised in Holy Angels. Quote, "I was never lonely because I took to the nuns as my own relatives. Sister Superior was my grandmother, and Sister Lucy was the teacher, and she was like my mama. She's the only one that's my guardian. So I have no complaint about the covenant. I am very glad that they showed me how to read and write." Close quote. Students involved in sports, music, drama, and dance found that these activities helped them maintain a sense of their own value and were sources of strength in later life. Andrew Amos recalled that at the Kamloops school, quote, the treatment was good as long as you excelled at sports, close quote. He went on to become a provincial boxing champion. Traveling to fights and games allowed students to leave the school and see other parts of the province. Amos recalled, quote, it was through competitive sports and the girls with their dancing and travel that we were able to cope and survive in the daily routine of life at the residential schools, close quote. Even if they were poorly equipped, residential school, hockey, football, and baseball teams provided many students with a refuge and source of pride. Alex, a student at St. Marc de Figuerie School in Amos, Quebec, said, quote, at the residential school, if it wasn't for hockey, I would have gone crazy. Sport became my support. Until I was 30 years old, I played, and when I was on ice, I would let it all out. Close quote. The prejudices of the day meant that girls enjoyed fewer athletic opportunities. The Kamloops School was known for its dance program. Vivian Ignis, one of the dancers, had mixed feelings about her experience, noting that dancers were not allowed to participate in sports for fear of injury. Despite this, she concluded that, quote, through the experience with the Kamloops Indian residential school dancers, I learned some assertiveness skills. I learned to smile even when I wasn't happy. I learned to get along and talk with people, and that was good. I learned a lot through that Irish nun, close quote. Some students were grateful for the religious instruction they received. Edna Gregoire, who attended the Kamloops school, for example, said, quote, my experience at the residential school was good. That's one thing I'll tell you. It was really good to be able to go to a school and learn how to read and write. And the other thing, the best of all, I was happy to learn about God. Close quote. Margaret Stonechild recalled the File Hills, Saskatchewan principal as a very good religious instructor. Quote, I am eternally grateful for that because I have a firm standing in Christian belief to this day. Close quote. Bernard Peni said that at File Hills he never felt religion was being forced down his throat. Some parents, at the urging of missionaries, sent their children to residential school specifically for a religious education. In some cases, strong personal relationships developed between students and staff. Eleanor Brass's parents, Fred and Mary Bell Dieter, were married at the File Hills boarding school, where Kate Gillespie, the president, and her sister Janet, the school matron, made the wedding arrangement and baked the wedding cake. Shirley Bear recalled one principal of the Prince Albert School as a tyrant. However, quote, the next principal, Reverend A.J. Ceresi, was an angel. After he came, the whole system changed. He was just like a father to the students. He was the minister who married my husband and me. Close quote. Many students, either on their own or with the encouragement of a well-remembered teacher, developed a love of learning. Jane Willis, at the Anglican school at Fort George on James Bay, credits her decision to complete her education to one of her teachers, who worked hard to develop students' self-confidence. Quote, learning was a pleasure with Mr. Woods as our cheerleader and coach. He urged us to ask questions, to take an active part in class instead of sitting back and taking his word for everything. Close quote. At the Moose Factory School in Ontario, Billy Diamond became a voracious reader. When the time came for him to move on to high school in Sault Ste. Marie, he saw it as an opportunity for adventure, learning, and meeting new friends. Once there, he helped form an Indian student council. Diamond went on, as leader of the James Bay Cree, to negotiate the 1975 James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, Canada's first comprehensive land claims agreement. While the residential school experience left him feeling embarrassed about his culture, Peter Ernick described the education he received in Chesterfield Inlet as top-notch. Quote, "As much as that particular teacher used to call us bloody dodos and no good for nothing, a bunch of hounds of iniquity, he taught us pretty good in terms of English." Letter to Sun Columnist by Jim Bissell. Quote, "The time has come for 70-year-old people like me to speak the truth. A little background. I grew up surrounded by 4 reserves and a large community of indigenous people, 95%. It was a community of wonderful, kind, very generous, very humorous people that remained that way even when very poor. Also, I have a wonderful, successful Indigenous daughter with grandkids and great-granddaughters. I am not a Catholic and do not belong to any church. I belong to me and my family, but I like Christian values. It should be noted that the missionaries there were very essential to our success in the northern communities at the time. I had my first TB test administered by a missionary trying to stop a TB outbreak. I hated her at the time for the scratches on my back. LOL. I got my first stitches from a wonderful nun. I got my first tooth pulled by a missionary. My first X-ray by the nuns. My first teacher was an angel called Sister Rita. I will never forget her and her deep love of all the children she met and taught over the years. My best teacher ever, and she was not qualified by the government standards. So, though I have never been a Catholic, their church has been very good for me, and although I do know of one very bad priest, most of the people were wonderful. I can still see Brother Filion, who later became a priest, working all by himself outside the school window, making a wonderful merry-go-round for the schoolyard. There were also 2 residential schools in the community. When I arrived in the community, there were no phones, very poor roads, mostly winter access, and not a lot of services other than the churches. The mission school was there long before my time. It has been told to me by elders that many small children, some way younger than school age, were dropped off at the missions sick, hoping the nuns could heal them. Sad to say, many died from the measles, diphtheria, TB, smallpox, flu, and many other conditions of the poor. Just the reality of the North. Years ago, most of the dead were placed in trees so the birds and other animals could take them back to nature. It was the churches that convinced them that part of their culture should be changed, so that to stop the spread of disease, so they started to bury the dead. If the dead were Christians, their grave was marked by a painted rock of a small wooden cross, which rotted away in 25 years or so. No one could afford a headstone, and if they could, there was no one that made them at the time. Times were hard, and in fact desperate in the 30s. Many people owed their lives to the missionaries, and we tend to forget that. They were not always right. No, of course not. But they actually wanted to educate, feed, and make the lives of all people better, regardless of where they came from. The churches do not need to apologize for trying to educate the poor, and the only system that would work for nomadic peoples. They need to say sorry, though, for protecting and moving about the few bad apples, priests. The government saying that they are sorry is meaningless. They didn't have a clue of the impact of their decisions at the time, and they don't have now. Most of the older generation that did suffer are long dead and gone or have forgiven. It seems to me that many of the new generation just want to be victims and feel money would solve their pain. We need to understand that very few people wanted to live in the North under the isolated conditions at the time, just to help out with a few indigenous people. After the federal government took over the school system, most of my junior high school teachers were immigrants from the British Commonwealth, India, England, Ireland, and other countries. As no Alberta teachers wanted to live up there when they could live in or near a city with a doctor, bank, good grocery store, ambulance, and my goodness, even policemen. The quality of my education suffered because all of a sudden the nuns were not qualified to teach us in 1967. Thus, I had to try and take lessons from teachers with a very heavy accent and hard to understand and wanting to move close to the cities as soon as they could. Thank goodness the missionaries were there for the past 300 years. Were they all good? No, but many were wonderful, and now that seems to be forgotten. How many of today's critics have relatives that went up to those communities in those times to try and help? Not many, I bet. The media today is only telling half the story. So I feel we as witnesses have to speak up and speak to the truth. If you want, I will take you to a sacred ground where hundreds of people were left in the ramps and trees or laid on the ground where they died. No one but historical memory marked their graves. Please believe me when I say that the missionaries were not a bunch of evil persons out to kill little children like it sounds in today's media. That is not what I witnessed. The missionaries knew that the ancient peoples of our land could not continue to exist in a nomadic and isolated society. So they tried to educate them and, of course, change their culture to be more compatible with the conditions of the times. Were they right? Maybe. I don't know. But at least they were willing to try and help. Like I tell my children, I cannot become indigenous like them, but they can become Canadians like me, and they are. There are more success stories out there than even you realize. The missionaries did not just throw bodies into the ground. Most were marked by a small wooden cross made by the brothers of the mission, or parents of the child. Those crosses are long gone. Sad but true. I can also take you to the unmarked graves of many people that were not indigenous, as well if you want. That was the way of the North. Sorry to ramble on for so long, but many things need to be said. And if the elders of our society lack the moral courage to say them, we are doomed anyway. Please encourage people to stand up and be heard for the good, not just the bad. Former Dene Chief C.C. Hodgins Macaulay. We all heard of horrible lies created by some individuals in order to receive as much money as they could. I spent 10 years there, going home every summer for the holidays on the mission boat. The nuns taught us so much. I only remember one nun who was very strict, and one nun who made us pray too much. In every society, you have people with personalities that are on the bad side. But I can swear on the Bible that my time in the covenant was good. We ate 3 meals a day, not fancy, but nourishing. A lot of recreation. Every winter they built us a big slide, and we would have fun sliding. And we went on many picnics in summer, and in the winter we would go for hay rides, sleighs pulled by oxen. We set rabbit snares and ate rabbit. They had pemmican, and that is pounded meat that natives love. They taught us how to knit stockings for ourselves, to do fancy beadings for moccasins, and to do quill work, from 2 quills up to 12 quills. We learned to make our own dresses. They taught how to cook and bake and clean. The boys had hockey and baseball. The native Indian boys used to always try to beat the Métis boys. Lots of fun. My family says the same thing. My sister swears by it. We were treated wonderfully. For a lot of poor kids, it was the only place people could get 3 square meals a day. An Open Letter to the Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada by Rodney A. Clifton. Quote, on March 20th, 2017, you, the Most Reverend Fred Hiltz, along with the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop Mark MacDonald and the General Secretary Archdeacon Michael Thompson, published an open letter addressed to Senator Lynn Bayek in response to a speech she gave in a Senate committee meeting. I simply remind you that Senator Bayek said there were some good things that happened in Indian residential schools. A point I thought would not be controversial. At least not to the extent that you, as the primate of the Anglican Church, would feel a need to attack what she said. The claim she made is true, because there is considerable evidence for her claim in the Truth and Reconciliation Report itself. And there is even further evidence in an op-ed that Senator Murray Sinclair published in the Calgary Herald a couple of years earlier. Despite this evidence, you said in your letter to Senator Bayek that there was nothing good about the IRS system. As an Anglican who has carefully read the TRC report and Senator Sinclair's op-ed, and as a person who spent some time in residential schools, I find your assertion troubling. Let me explain why. Reading your message to Senator Bayek brought back memories of a letter I received more than 50 years earlier. In August 1966, I was boarding at Old Sun, the Anglican residential school, in the Siksika First Nation, Blackfoot Reserve in southern Alberta. I received a letter offering me a position as the senior boys supervisor at Stringer Hall, the Anglican residential hostel in Inuvik, NWT, for the 1966 to 67 year. I welcomed this job offer, in part because it would help me better understand Indian and Eskimo students, and partly because I could save money to continue with my university studies, paying for tuition, books, and room and board. 2 years earlier, in 1964, I had begun my teacher training in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. After completing my first year in the B.Ed program, I joined a small group of students in a new cross-cultural program preparing teachers to work in Canada's north and in schools on Métis colonies and First Nations reserves. The student teachers in this program were required to complete a summer internship, and I was assigned to the Blackfoot Reserve, 100 kilometers east of Calgary. From the beginning of May to the end of August, I worked in the agency office as a go-for-it. The male staff members, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, called me a swamper, whose job was assisting the office staff. I also did other jobs on the reserve, registering children for kindergarten, acting as a truancy officer, working with local ranchers, baling hay and branding calves, helping erect teepees for the Sundance, helping with handing out the $5 treaty money at treaty days, and many other things that would expand my understanding of Aboriginal people. I was truly fortunate because a local family, the Youngman family, adopted me, inviting me to their home and to their family gatherings, Indian days, rodeos, and Sunday picnics. During that summer, I stayed in a room in the teacher's wing at Old Sun. When I arrived in May, there were Siksika students in residence, but at the end of June, there were only 5 people living at the school. The Anglican priest, the Reverend R.F. Brown, the 3 Rosesting girls, young orphaned Cree children from Hobama, and me. Hilda Redgun, a local Siksika woman, worked at the school during the day to make meals and to care for the little girls. By the beginning of August, 3 months into my internship, Indian Affairs had still not paid me the modest stipend promised, so I had to make some money before returning to university. Seeing an advertisement in the Anglican Journal, I applied for the senior boys position at Stringer Hall, and, as you can imagine, I welcomed the letter offering me the job. Following my summer work on the Blackfoot Reserve, the residential supervisor's position in Inuvik was exactly what I needed to further my understanding of Aboriginal culture. In addition, I would be able to save enough money to return to university. It was, as you will see, a fascinating experience, and I took copious notes and photographs, all of which have been filed with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. In late August, I boarded an old DC-4 at the municipal airport in Edmonton. 12 hours later, after many stops at small communities along the Mackenzie River, I arrived at the Inuvik Airport, where I was met by the hostel administrator, the Reverend Leonard Holman. We drove to the community of Inuvik, and I settled into my new bedroom situated between the dorm rooms in Stringer Hall, the Anglican hostel. The next day, I toured the building and received my job description, supervising 85 senior boys between the ages of 12 and about 21, housed in 3 dormitory rooms for 6 days a week. I would be responsible for these boys for some 22 hours a day. Of course, on most days, I did not supervise boys during school hours. But if students were too ill to go to school, but not sick enough to be in the hostel infirmary, they remained in the dormitories where I was responsible for them. As it turned out, 2 or 3 times a week, I was up at various times during the night, looking after boys who were ill or who were being bothered by other boys. Because the children's home communities were often far away, most of the students remained in residence on weekends and during the Christmas and Easter breaks. Very soon, I realized that the year was going to be very demanding. Yet, I thought it would be interesting, and indeed, it was a year I have never forgotten. Within a few days, students began arriving to reside in the hostel. Some came by aircraft from small coastal communities such as Tuktoyaktuk, Saxe Harbor, and Cambridge Bay. Others came by boat and aircraft from communities along the Mackenzie River, including Aklavik, Fort McPherson, and Fort Good Hope. I do not recall any of the children crying at night because they were lonely. Rather, the new arrivals, especially the Inuit children, were quite stoic and reserved, hesitant to interact with children and adults they did not know. I remember that while the Inuit children were very shy but excited about going to school, the Dene, Métis, and Caucasian children were much more outgoing and noisier. In fact, some Dene boys were quite aggressive towards Inuit boys. Reverend Holman and his wife, who was the matron, welcomed all the children with kindness and, indeed, with a considerable dose of love. The older children quickly found friends and relatives as students decided which beds they would have and who would sleep next to them. One of the obvious signs of the difficulties that young children have in adapting to new and strange environments is bedwetting. But, as my notes indicate, bedwetting was infrequent, and when it occurred, it mostly happened after the children had watched a movie in the gymnasium, stayed up later than normal, and consumed soft drinks. We now know that many children were physically and sexually abused in residential schools, both by the other students and by staff members. Such abuse of children is clearly reprehensible, and all adults, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, who preyed upon or brutalized children should be punished for their crimes. So should any administrators from both the churches and the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs who covered up these crimes. But at the same time, innocent people who worked in Indian residential schools and those who instructed these children should not be maligned with false accusations. Many of them should, in fact, be honored by their respective churches for their service they provided to these children. Returning to the story of my life at Stringer Hall, by the beginning of September, when classes began at the nearby Sir Alexander Mackenzie School, about 280 students were in residence. 73% were Inuit, 16% were Dene, and 12% were Caucasian and Métis. A similar number of students resided in Grolier Hall, the Roman Catholic hostel, but there were fewer Inuit, more Dene, and about the same percentage of Caucasian and Métis students in that hostel. Strangely, the TRC report does not mention that, in the far north, all students, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, went to a residential institution if their homes were in small communities without day schools. Also, the report does not state that some of the children arrived at Stringer Hall in September wearing the same clothing they wore when they went home in the spring, not having bathed or changed in 2 months. Some of these children had been standing in smudge fires trying to escape the hordes of blood-sucking insects, and a number had arrived with infected bug bites on their scalps. A few children arrived with ear infections so severe that pus was running down their necks. At the beginning of the year, these children cried themselves to sleep. As you might expect, the priority of the residential school staff, particularly the nursing sister, was to clean up the children and treat their infections. To put the students' living conditions and infections into context, anyone reading this account needs to realize that it wasn't until the early 1950s that a weekly bath with a change of clothes became the norm for most urban Canadians. For people living on farms and in small communities where water had to be hand-pumped from wells and heated on coal and wood stoves, a bath with a change of clothing was a luxury reserved for special occasions. In the north, it was even more difficult to bathe and change clothing, especially for the children who were with their parents living in tents at hunting and fishing camps. There is little doubt that the hostel children appreciated ending a busy week with a hot shower, clean pajamas, and a chance to slip between clean sheets in their very own beds, just as other Canadian children did. Having the children bathe, get their hair cut by older boys, and put on a clean, institutional clothing is now called cultural genocide, a phrase that completely distorts what we were doing at the time, keeping children clean, well-fed, and healthy. One story clearly illustrates the kind of treatment the children received. A few days after I arrived, a young woman walked into the staff dining room. Her name was Rosaline Malik, and she was the new residential nurse. Her clothes were strange, and by her accent, we knew she wasn't Canadian. Over dinner, she told us that she had come from London, England, to be our nursing sister. To the surprise of many Canadians on staff, this 22-year-old woman had come from the centre of the British Commonwealth to one of its most distant outposts. From a warm autumn day in England to a cold, dark, and bleak August evening 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle. From a major world city to a small, isolated community hugging the east bank of the Mackenzie River. She told us that she was going to work in the hospital as part of her Christian service. All of us were astounded by her commitment to work with Aboriginal children. In early December, when the sun had already sunk below the southern horizon, a senior boy, John, complained that he was too sick to attend school. I was not surprised, given his peaky appearance. As might be expected, some boys would sometimes feign illness so they could get a day off from classes, but this young man was not one of those who tried to avoid going to school. After sending the other 84 students to breakfast in the dining room and going to John's bed, one of the 60 in the largest dorm, I helped him climb the stairs to the second floor, and together we shuffled along the hall to the infirmary. "Miss Malik," I said, "I have brought John because he is extremely sick. I know you're on your way to breakfast, but could you please look after him?" Immediately she began asking John questions about his symptoms. I left John in Miss Malik's care and went down for breakfast. Besides being responsible for this 12-year-old, I had to ensure that the other boys got fed, went back to the dorms, straightened up their beds, brushed their teeth, put on their parkas and mukluks, and went off to school. At about 11 a.m., Miss Malik came to the senior boys' dorms and found me sorting clothing. Clean clothing was stored in each boy's numbered cubicle, 1 to 100, in a locked storeroom, and sorting clothing was an important and time-consuming part of my job. Of course, the easiest way of sorting and storing clothes for 85 boys was to assign numbered cubicles to each boy, so that the numbers of the cubicles matched the numbers on their clothing. Even my clothing had a number. These numbers were never used to refer to any of the boys in the residence, not even for those children with long and difficult indigenous names. Nurse Malik told me that John probably had appendicitis, and that she had helped Reverend Holman take him to the hospital. At coffee break that afternoon, she told the staff that a doctor had phoned to say that John's appendix had burst, and emergency surgery had just finished. After a few hours in the recovery room, she said John would be transferred to a general ward, and people could visit him in a day or two. In fact, many staff members and students did exactly that over the next few days. Another story illustrates the dedication that staff members gave to the children in their charge. In that same early December, I spotted a man cross-country skiing with a group of children on a trail behind Grolier Hall, the Roman Catholic hostel. The next day, during my 2-hour break from residential duties, I walked over to the ski hut and met Friar Jean-Marie Mouchette, the Catholic priest who was teaching these northern children to cross-country ski. I told him that I was the senior boys supervisor at Stringer Hall, and a cross-country skier myself, having grown up in Jasper. When I asked him if I could ski with his club, he said that I could use the trails, and that I should tell the Anglican students that if they wanted to learn to ski, he would equip and teach them. My parents sent my skis to Inuvik, and several of the Anglican children from Stringer Hall joined Mr. Mouchette's ski club using skis, boots, and poles donated by the Roman Catholic Church. The ecumenical cooperation was, I think, something to celebrate both then and now. That was my introduction to Friar Mochette, a ski coach about whom Canada would soon hear more. I recall seeing students from Grolier Hall, Peter Allen, Sharon and Shirley Firth, and Jeanette Tourangeau out on the ski trail in those cold, dark days in December and January. Friar Mochette had strung electric lights through the trees above the trail, lights which were certainly needed when the sun was below the horizon during those days in the dead of winter. I will never forget something Friar Mochette told me late one afternoon as we watched the children returning from a 90-minute training run. All these children need is to learn to overcome themselves, and then nothing can stop them. He believed that these Indigenous students could determine the way their lives unfolded. He was, of course, correct. In a few years, a number of these Aboriginal skiers became members of the Canadian National Cross-Country Ski Team, winning medals across North America and around Europe, and representing Canada in the 1972 Winter Olympics in Sapporo, Japan. Imagine what it was like for these Aboriginal children to be learning how to cross-country ski in Inuvik in 1966, and then 6 years later to be representing their country at the Olympic Games in Japan. Many people seem to be unaware that some residential school employees were Aboriginals, and this was true at both Old Sun and Stringer Hall. At Stringer Hall, for example, 2 of the 6 upper visitors were young Inuit women, Annie and Lucy, who, contrary to considerable testimony in the TRC report, spoke to the young Inuit children in their mother tongue. Mrs. Thomas, a Dene woman who was the school's seamstress, made parkas and mucklucks for the children and lived in the hostel with her 4-year-old daughter. She spoke both English and her native language to the Dene children, but most of the Dene and Métis children spoke English upon their arrival. In general, the relationships between staff and students were very cordial and often friendly. There were, of course, tense and even agitated moments because the children were often cooped up in the residence on Saturdays and Sundays when blizzards were blowing outside. At times, staff members who never got enough sleep could be irritable, especially if children were ill during the night. Sometimes students squabbled among themselves. The Dene boys often treated the Inuit boys in condescending ways, picking on them and calling them unacceptable names. As the supervisor, my job was to calm these situations and keep all the boys treating each other with respect. The young children, the junior boys and the girls, loved spending time with some of the staff members. I remember with great fondness some of the Inuit children coming to my room on Saturday afternoons to take Nurse Malak and me for walks. Often we would climb the hill behind the hostel so the children could slide down the snow-covered road on cardboard boxes. At other times, we walked out on the ice of the Mackenzie River, carefully avoiding the dog sled trails used by people going to trap lines and hunting camps, or traveling between communities. The children knew how dangerous dog teams could be because they had either heard about or seen people who had been attacked by dogs. During that very winter, as her parents watched in horror, a young girl had been killed by a dog team on a trail close to Fort McPherson. Life in the North was tough and precarious, and these children knew it. During our winter walks, I would practice the Inuktitut expressions the children had taught me. I had told some of the 5- and 6-year-old children that if they taught me to speak Inuktitut, I would help them learn English. By February, the children, who are always polite and respectful, could speak rudimentary English. But all I could say were a few Inuktitut phrases, and they were of the taboo variety. Predictably, the children encouraged me to say these naughty phrases and found my speech very amusing. Funny, funny, Mr. Clifton, they would giggle. The little girls would turn their backs on me, cover their mouths with their hands, and laugh quietly, their dark eyes dancing with glee as they held on to each other. I called this group the giggling girls, thus teaching them a new English expression, one that they appreciated when I teased them by saying, "Oh no, here are the giggling girls coming to take me for a walk. I had better get my parka and mukluks on." The indigenous and non-indigenous adults I knew in the Anglican residential schools genuinely wanted to help the children receive a good education to prepare them for the modern world. Most were caring people, but a couple of the older supervisors were cranky and tired, probably because they had been supervising large groups of children for many years. These older supervisors also clung to the idea that strict discipline was the only way to keep children from taking the wrong path. But to the best of my memory, most staff members were trying to fulfill the evangelic calling of committed Christians to help the poor, tend to the weak, and treat the sick. Archbishop Hiltz, I must tell you that my mind was filled with these fond memories when I read your open letter to Senator Bayek. With deep respect to you and the Church, I think your letter ignores and even denies the work and the love that Nurse Malloch and thousands of other Anglicans gave to numerous Indigenous children. If there was nothing good about the residential school system, how would you describe what Nurse Malloch did in saving the life of that 12-year-old Inuit boy? Had John been out at the hunting camp with his parents, no matter how much they loved him, he surely would have died a painful death. The TRC report references the sad reality that 3,201 children died while enrolled in the residential schools and hostels, most of them from infectious diseases like tuberculosis and influenza. The death of any child is, of course, dreadful to contemplate, but surprisingly, there is no discussion, not one word in the TRC report, about the countless children like John whose lives were saved because residential school staff looked after them, loved them, and cared for them. Likewise, there is no mention of the innumerable children with infected bug bites whom Nurse Malloch and the many other dedicated medical professionals treated. Likewise, there is no recognition of hundreds of 6-year-olds who immediately received treatment for their eardrums, which were so badly infected that green smelly pus was running down their necks. Can you imagine what it is like to hear 5- and 6-year-old children cry themselves to sleep until antibiotics gave them relief? In fairness, we must all be mindful of the thousands of good and decent Canadians, many of them Anglicans and the very backbone of your church, who put their lives on hold for little pay and hardly any sleep, who went forth to serve the Church, their Lord, and Canadian Indigenous children with kindness, honor, respect, and faith. Now, all they ask for, many from beyond the grave, is a little recognition of some of the good things they did. They ask for nothing more. Senator Bayek was carrying the voices of these forgotten Anglicans to you and to the other Canadians when she spoke up in the Senate hearing. A good deal of evidence exists in published accounts, correspondences, and conversations that I have had with former IRS workers and students that my experiences were quite typical. But while some parts of the TRC's final report acknowledge those positive and very human experiences, the picture that the summary and legacy volumes of the report and the media have given to the Canadian public is a partial and skewed version of the IRS reality that many Indigenous children experienced. When I, as a 21-year-old university student, became a residential supervisor in Stringer Hall in 1966, I could not imagine that many years later the Anglican Church would express regret and guilt about its management and support of Indian residential schools and hostels. Neither could I imagine that the Anglican employees and supporters of those residential institutions would be vilified by church leaders for their involvement in a Christian mission that, at the time, seemed so worthwhile and so very necessary. There are, I think, at least 3 things that you, Bishop MacDonald and Archdeacon Thompson, could do to recognize the role that these selfless Christians played in the history of Indian residential schools. First, you could encourage those who worked in the IRS system and those who were once students to talk more about all their experiences, not just the negative ones. Second, as Anglicans say in their Sunday prayers, and especially when they say prayers for you, Bishop MacDonald, and the residential school survivors, you, as leaders of the church, could remind parishioners to offer up a few prayers for the thousands of committed but forgotten Christians who worked tirelessly, often in dangerous and difficult circumstances, for long hours and with extraordinarily little pay, helping IRS children. Finally, the Anglican Church itself could officially and bravely recognize the excellent work that many committed Christians did in Anglican missions that, at the time, seemed so appropriate, even imperative, but is now devalued and vilified by those who refer to everything that happened to Indigenous students in these institutions as cultural genocide. (2022) Update. I am pleased to learn that, after a year of the reported mass grave discovery, the church burnings, and the publication of this article in 2021, not a single body has been found. While it is true that many Indigenous children tragically died from illnesses or were victims of abuse, there is no evidence that any were murdered and secretly buried. It seems that the initial claim was based on soil disturbances found using a technology called ground-penetrating radar. Dr. Sarah Bellew found anomalies and seemed to have prematurely reported them as probable burials. A tooth that was possibly human was also found. But over the past year, there have been investigations. It turns out that the tooth wasn't human. There are disturbances in the soil because the school has a long history of building things like roads or pipes for irrigation there. Moreover, excavations seem to have been going on at the site for decades. No secret graves have yet been discovered. For more information on the mistakes and exaggerations that led to these tragic attacks on our churches, I highly recommend the following articles. Suggestions for further reading. 1 year later, still no evidence of unmarked graves, by retired Judge Brian Geishbrett. In Kamloops, not one body has been found, by Professor Jacques Rouliard. The False Narrative of Residential School Burials, by Professor Tom Flanagan. From Truth Comes Reconciliation, Assessing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Report, by Dr. Rodney A. Clifton and Mark DeWolf. Billy Remembers, Analyzing the Indian Residential School Moral Panic, by Dr. Francis Widowson. Where Are the Children Buried? By Dr. Scott Hamilton. A Narrative Reversal Like No Other, by James Pugh. Len Merchant's Indian Residential School Experience, by James C. McRae. Digging for the Truth About Canada's Residential School Graves, by Jaime Rubenstein. The Year of the Graves, How the World's Media Got It Wrong on Residential School Graves by the National Post. No evidence of unmarked graves related to Shubenacadie Residential School. Researchers say evidence of unmarked graves was found during search, but they predate the school. CBC. The Indigenous mass grave that wasn't. The Spectator. No unmarked graves found at Nova Scotia Residential School. The National Post. Why an Oji-Cree community is trying to rebuild its Catholic Church. CBC. About the author. Drew Eldridge is an author and educator from Winnipeg, Manitoba. He has an English degree from the University of Winnipeg and is the editor of a Christian apologetics publication called Christian Voices.